Tonight, we won't open party archives or quote the slogans painted on factory walls. Instead, we'll all walk into a stairwell where the light hums like it, as remembering a song from another apartment. A single bulb warms the concrete in patient circles. The air smells faintly of dust, soap, and someone's evening plans. Outside, snow folds the city into hush, and somewhere below, a payphone clicks twice, the sound of courage rehearsing itself. Here, romance is not a performance, but an arrangement with time. Meet at the shift's end, talk until the last tram, promise nothing but a walk home under state-approved weather. Love learns to speak through shared gloves and barred kettles, through a window fogged on both sides. The heart here doesn't race. It cues, and yet, in that quiet patience, warmth finds a way to register itself without paperwork. So lower the lights. Let the hum of the stairwell fill the space between thoughts. And if your breathing slows with the rhythm of the city settling into snow, that's already enough to belong here. Outside, the step folds itself into silence, but inside the tent, order breathes. The coals whisper rules older than parchment, and the air carries them like a careful translation. Where to stand, when to bow, how to offer a blade so it means peace. Beyond the flap, frost writes its own alphabet on leather. Inside, the letters become gestures, patient and exact. This is not ceremony, it is navigation. To live here is to move by rhythm instead of map, to let each custom mark a safe line across the endless. A stairwell bulb hums, warming up like it remembers being sunlight once. Its faint circle of light steadies the concrete, and for a moment the air smells of soap, metal, and patience. Outside, snow folds the city into hush. A payphone clicks twice, and the sound hangs like a promise between walls. In that pause, courage feels domestic borrowed from electricity and shared across landings. Romance here doesn't begin with confession, but with a routine. Two gloves meeting on the same railing, a kettle humming in another flat, footsteps slowing near the door that never fully closes. The city learns to speak quietly, so no one has to stop listening. And somewhere inside this hush, a story begins about how people found each other through work shifts and winter walks, through paper tickets and fogged glass, through everything that stayed warm just long enough to be called love. Finding each other began in the corridors where people already were. Corridors explain a great deal about socialism. They belong to everyone, and so they are unfenced introductions. After work brigades signed the day's quotas, the stairwells became neutral ground, and the kettle in the dorm kitchenette issued visas to conversations that did not require the dean's approval. Comsmol meetings ended. Someone gathered the posters that told everyone to be cheerful next week, and two people who had passed each other 20 times in the printing shop finally held the same door for a beat too long. The Dom Culture, the House of Culture, liked to host rehearsals, and rehearsals like to end late, because art knows that timing is also lighting. When the rehearsal ended, a small group slipped out into the corridor for a registered walk to the tram stop. A friend of a friend complained about a shift swap that sounded suspiciously like a date, and probably was. The early evening belonged to walking, which asked for no permit and almost no money. It asked instead for the ability to match step lengths on uneven sidewalks and to share humor that did not need to leave a trace. This is a surprisingly high bar, even in free societies. Messages moved almost as slowly as the people carrying them, and the slowness worked like time-lapse honesty. Telephones lived in hallways where neighbors listened kindly and forgot badly. The word for privacy was the distance between two coats on the same hook. A note could slide under a door with the exact grace of a bus ticket. It was difficult to be dramatic while crouching with stationery. Sometimes you left a message with the cloakroom auntie because she outlived governments and never lost a parcel. Sometimes the library received a folded page that looked like a request for Tolstoy but asked for Tuesday. A cassette tape passed hand to hand with a few songs on side A, and the real message after the chorus. It is hard to imagine swiping left through a magnetic tape, but you could fast forward with a pencil if your wrist believed in destiny. When the tram stalled, the plan became tea in paper cups, which grew soft and pilgrim-shaped, and a longer route which counted as more conversation and therefore better planning. The city quietly agreed that attention is a rationed good, and that walking spends it sensibly. Places and rituals arranged themselves with the predictability of a timetable that believed in weekends. Parks offered benches that learned names first and kept secrets second. A bench has a good memory for the shape of a winter coat and a poor memory for exact words, which is the correct ratio for public furniture. Clubs at the Dom Culturi supplied a dance floor, where a slow dance was also a strategic retreat from politics. When the twist arrived a decade late, it arrived politely and apologized. The embankment was the grand corridor under the sky. Bridges carried the rest, because bridges do not ask for passports from people who are only looking at water. Ice cream from a Stalovaya window came in bricks that tasted faintly of iron coins, which made them feel paid for. Saturday dances promised waltz, twist, and the kind of slow song that sighs and sets down a suitcase. Courage queued up in the coat check beside it. Good nights ended with warm hands and cold noses and no witnesses, because the city preferred to be chaperoned by temperature rather than law. Beyond the city ran the Electrica, the suburban train that connected Hope to fences. Buying a ticket was also buying time. The car filled with people holding berries, an enamel bucket, and the belief that the air would be different on the other side of the line. Couples rode to a dacha not always their own, which is to say it belonged to a friend of an aunt or an aunt of a friend, which is how property felt more like a large family tree than a map. At the dacha, the neighbors politely disliked punctuation. Sentences were short to save breath, and questions ended in steam from the samovar. Glasses fogged with warmth you could eat with a spoon. The return trip raced the curfew like it was a friendly race with a very serious referee. Counting stops felt like counting promises. 2 more until we say goodbye, 1 more until we don't yet. If the gate closed early, the station became the last scene, and the bench promoted itself to chaperone. A micro hook, if you will. Once, an Electrica conductor became an impromptu celebrant and declared 2 riders engaged, simply because they had missed the last train together 3 weekends in a row. No papers were filed, the memory was. That proved portable. Rules were present, but they preferred uniforms to shouting. A stamp in your passport, the propiska decided which district your evening should end in, as if romance had city limits posted softly at the end of a street. Dorm attendants wrote names in pencil with the confident pressure of people who never broke anything and rarely forgot. Volunteer patrols, the druzhniki, walked like weather. You prepared for them by carrying a hat and good explanations. A polite paper answered faster than a strong voice. There is a kind of power that only official ink believes in. Privacy was an art of timing rather than force. Early trams, late walks. A light that failed on cue because it had been failing for years. If you needed a statistic, it was how many steps it took to cross the landing between 2 apartments without being seen by either door. The number varied by building, which is why Love preferred a local schedule. Money in shortage makes gifts creative and proofs of care unusually fragrant. Roses were rare enough to behave like celebrities. Oranges could do the job with a brighter smell and came with vitamins, which made them almost moral. Jeans, in some cities, carried the same aura as foreign diplomacy. Tights were trust. Polish chocolate worked as both dessert and certificate, a dual-use item the planners had not intended. A cinema ticket could be traded like a favor because the film was common property, but the seat time was not. A scarf laid across a chair held the place the way a treaty holds a river. The deficit economy trained the eye to read objects as verbs. This jar means save, this book means return, this radio means we can be quiet together on purpose. What could not be bought was mended, baked, or found. Repair acquired the softness of intimacy because it required patience and shared light. Perhaps this is why the most reliable proposal was a new handle screwed onto a pan without being asked. Milestones arrived with the dignity of paperwork and the modesty of kitchen tables. The path from Let's Walk to Zaz's was not long, but it had checkpoints. Meeting each other as parents in kitchens that seated 3, and somehow heard 10 practicing small toasts without spilling, posing for photos that displayed coats, boots, and the grin that ignored weather. Zach's itself was a modest theater of sentences that had waited their turn since the revolution. There were bows, brief speeches, and Soviet champagne that fizzed like relief. You might not think a registry office could smell like hope and disinfectant at once, but many things did. A one-room flat became a hall through the application of salads, toasts, and 3 stools invited to behave like chairs. The record player wobbled kindly because it had already served 3 families, which made it an elder statesman of music. The wedding photo album weighed more than the rings. It was important that it did. The day after did not rush. 2 families shared walls and Sundays until keys caught up with years. An apartment application grew thicker while patience grew specific. Winter lists looked like coal and books and blankets. Summer lists were paint and nails and a promise about curtains. The door closed softly, passport kept, voice low, tomorrow penciled between work and a walk. There is a Soviet micro-ritual for wiping your feet on the mat by a new door. You do it slower, and that counts as a blessing. A cue became a group gift. It taught breathing. The quiet economy continued its lessons. A borrowed drill confirmed friendship. A return jar promised another visit. A stapled page at the housing office affirmed that promises can be stapled, which is almost as good as binding. The future was registered in a ledger whose cover had seen better decades. Inside, the ink still looked new. We drift back to the beginning, to those corridors of Komsomol and work where introductions preferred fluorescent lighting. The notice board told you many things, none of them about love, which is why it was useful. A kettle occupied the corner like a tiny, patient locomotive. It announced that there would be tea and therefore company, because no one brewed a single glass alone unless the samovar was on strike. Rosters pinned with blunt pens displayed shifts for the week. On the margins, someone had practiced a signature they hadn't yet been asked for. Couples met in brigades in dorm corridors and the House of Culture after rehearsal, when the director finally said, "Enough," which is theater for "go outside. It's better there." A friend of a friend remembered your name wrong, but your hat correctly. This meant they were paying attention. The evening did not need a venue because the city had sidewalks the length of novels, and the best chapter was always the route home. Messages, still moving at a pace endorsed by stairwells, kept the rhythm humane. Phones in hallways could be booked by goodwill alone. You learned to smile while using them in case the smile improved memory. Notes hid in library drawers under author cards that had catalog numbers like little riddles. The note writer believed you would find the right drawer because you knew Gogol better than they did, which was a compliment. Once, a cassette carried a declaration covered by 3 broadcasts taped off the radio, a weather report, a children's story, and the song that really mattered. Rewinding to the exact sentence required a degree of manual dexterity that counts as romance in any era. When a bus broke down, everyone looked at their wrists, even though very few wore watches, a communal gesture that replaced being late with being together. The places waited with patience. The park trees inhaled snow so quietly you could hear it. Benches measured seasons by the length of coats. Saturday dances at the Dom Culturi followed the generous logic of communal spaces. You didn't need to be graceful. You only needed to take turns. The band could play anything as long as it produced something you could hold hands to. The embankment specialized in long looks and short farewells. Bridges were the only architecture that understood metaphors and still let trams run on time. Ice cream flowed through the window of the Stalavaya in rectangles, which is not the most romantic shape, but it made stacking possible and taught a valuable lesson about geometry and dessert. Good nights were not documented. The city laced up its boots and pretended not to see. Beyond the ring road, the Electrica counted out afternoon light. The ticket was a passport to berries and fences and conversations with fewer witnesses, which is another way of describing adulthood. At Badasha, people looked like the weather looked, which was honest. Fogged glasses and woolen hats erased distinctions you didn't need later. The neighbors pursued a healthy distrust of punctuation because a gesture could finish a sentence with less risk. Someone's uncle slaughtered a chicken using a manual written in 1938 and republished by memory ever since. The return train was a moving curfew. Each stop asked whether you had promised to be back by midnight. Each door asked whether promises left a receipt. If the gate was shut, the bench became the final form of furniture, supportive, silent, splintery, and perfectly in the right place. There is a legend, never confirmed, that a certain conductor accepted a jar of pickles as a penalty for missed stops. The jar was later returned empty, which counts as civic virtue. Rules hovered, but they rarely occupied the center of the frame. Propiska stamps lived in passports the way compass roses live on maps. They tell you where you really are, which is not always where you're standing. Dorm attendants monitored doorways with the institutional kindness of people who had seen it all yesterday and would see it again tomorrow. The Druzhniki appeared like a weather system, light flurries of questions, scattered checks toward evening, a hard freeze if someone became unlucky. The safest answer, like the safest coat, was the most ordinary one. Privacy, more a choreography than a status, used light bulbs on timers and the acoustics of stairwells. A door left open with a wedge of cardboard meant we re-home but not receiving the committee. If one asks how any of this compares to modern dating apps, the comparison is unfair to the stairwells. They matched on proximity, which is every app's first principle. They also matched on the bravery of showing up during mud season, an algorithm still being refined. Gifts in a deficit economy learned poetry by accident. Roses could be heroic, but an orange was proof of logistics. Jeans were a passport in fabric form. Lending them was practically a diplomatic mission. A jar of jam said, "I kept summer for you in a glass bank." Tights traveled like rumors and were as carefully folded. Polish chocolate was an international agreement designed to melt at domestic temperatures. Cinema tickets traded hands like minor currency, and later, in the darkness, confirmed that the price of an hour is best paid in company. A scarf draped across a chair kept the place in the way a modest cloud keeps the sun interesting. When cash could not achieve a goal, mending did. A repaired plug or a resoled shoe declared gently that permanence is a series of small, stubborn decisions. If you think this sounds romantic, consider that the screwdriver was often borrowed from an entire stairwell and returned with a thank you note scotch taped to the handle. Zax waited at the end of the corridor, where signs are written in polite fonts. The day of registration was a masterpiece of compressing ceremony into a lunch break. Vows 2 sentences with legal weight, a witness clearing their throat for emphasis, and the cork of Soviet champagne escaping with a noise exactly between triumph and relief. Photographs proved that winter could be ignored by smiling. Coats, boots, and a grin produced a climate called celebration. The reception arranged itself inside a one-room apartment that expanded horizontally into neighboring kitchens through the wormholes of friendship. Salads multiplied according to a principle known as someone will be hungry again in a minute. Toasts began with health and landed somewhere inside gratitude. The record player rotated at a speed more or less compatible with the song. The couple rotated at a speed more or less compatible with the future. The album of photographs became heavy enough to outvote memory when necessary. Afterward, life resumed its main themes in a new key. Housing offices collected applications the way libraries collect overdue books. Each page added weight to desire. Until keys arrived, 2 families traded Sundays like good shifts, and the corridor learned the sound of 2 different sets of slippers. Winter prepared projects that began with hot water and ended with blankets. Summer offered paint and a lesson on what the word primer really means. The door closed gently on a passport stored where it couldn't fall. A voice kept low because neighbors were reading, and tomorrow penciled between work and a walk because pencils forgive. Cues tutored patience into a social skill. They made small talk into a civic virtue and allowed children to measure their age by how many places they were trusted to hold. A borrowed drill gathered stories as it traveled. The jar returned empty but clean was a poem. Every promise left a staple somewhere. If you're still listening, the bulb in the stairwell is likely warm by now, and the payphone has eaten its coin and decided to stay full. This is how romance sounded in a place where walking was the national courtship and benches were witnesses who never learned to write. People met where they already worked and studied, because corridors were socialist and efficient. They sent messages at the speed of stairwells and replied with gestures that preferred not to be archived. They visited parks, clubs, and the embankment, purchased ice cream that held its shape like a building, and danced to music that arrived late but made no excuses. They rode electrichki to dayshes where fences leaned, and neighbors preferred steam to punctuation. They raced curfew back. They navigated rules with papers and timing, gave gifts that smelt like oranges and sincerity, and registered their promises at Zagays with photos that make winter look unreasonable. Then they returned to kitchens that fit 3 and heard 10, to lists, to cues, to jars and trolls and cardboard wedges for doors, to a future penciled softly between work and a walk. If you drift now, the city will keep the rest. It has good pockets for patience and long routes home. You might not expect the length of iron chain to be the most romantic object in a library, but in the medieval monastery it often was. It didn't sigh or rustle or sparkle. It simply connected a book to a desk with the patient logic of gravity and rule. If you're still awake by the time I reach the part about vellum cleaning schedules, feel free to subscribe for more gentle paperwork in the dark ages. Or don't. There's no fine for sleeping through cataloging. Tonight we are visiting a set of rooms that smelled of hide glue and beeswax, where the loudest event each hour was a bell that rang from somewhere else. We will drift past oak lecterns as tall as arguments and cabinets with doors like habits, and notice, if we must, that knowledge here traveled at the speed of a careful walk. This is the quietly riveting world of monastic libraries and their ordinary miracles. How a book is kept, found, mended, lent, and remembered by men who prayed on schedule and misplaced very little besides time. The morning opens with keys. They are large enough to be seen in a painting from across the nave, and they live on a ring like a small halo that never learned to float. A librarian armorius, a word shaped like a cupboard, collects the set from the prior with a nod that includes the history of obedience. If he drops them, they will bruise the floor. The room he unlocks keeps its breath. Stone walls and thick windows are good at holding it. Along one side stand desks fitted with chains that drift down to iron staples, each link slightly flattened by centuries of turning pages right to left and back again. The chains make a soft metal sentence as they move, a sentence always ending in period, enough for today. Shelves carry books that behave like small animals, heavy, calm, bound in skin. Their titles are not on the covers. They are whispers inside. To find them, the armorius consults a register that looks like a family thinking carefully about itself. Entries are neat, inks are stable colors like conviction, and margins contain the most restrained jokes in Europe. Small pointing hands, modest flowers, a frog that the rubricator added because frogs are funny by vocation. Somewhere a novice wipes a desk with vinegar water as if the wood has sinned. On a high perch, a candle's brass dish remembers last night's wax like geography. It did not begin here. A bookstay starts in its binding, which is a leather coat fitted over a spine of cords that holds signatures of parchment like ribs. Parchment is animal skin that forgot to be an animal. The monks handle it with a tenderness that reads as apology. Scratch awls, bone folders, and twine work in a quiet choreography that repeats across centuries with very little innovation and no desire for any. When a cover warps in damp weather, it wears clasps, small bronze hands that believe in closure. The chain is attached at the foredge because monks open volumes near the spine and wish to protect it. The first page carries a donation note or a warning that is also a prayer. This book belongs to Saint Mary. If you steal it, may you forget the Psalms in the middle and never find the beginning again. It is difficult to improve on medieval customer service. A traveler might ask, why chain at all? Because each book is the price of a small field in good weather, and fields are not left to stroll. The chain does not insult the reader. It honors the copyist. By mid-morning, the readers arrive, not many, because learning is a monastic crop with a small acreage and dependable harvest. A scholar places his hand on a book like a porter accepts a parcel. He opens with 2 fingers and a breath, and anchors the corners with weights that look like obedient plums. The quill he carries has a knife for a partner. They travel as a married pair. On the page, the script is a tidy nation with borders that never wore. When the reader turns a leaf, the chain whispers yes. He pauses to hum a half-line of Latin because reading silently is new and still feels a little rude, the way typing on a phone at dinner does now. Another monk copies a passage into a notebook made of stale vellum and fresh intention. He writes slowly because ink dries at monastic speed. A third monk is not reading at all. He is counting the pages of a massive commentary to be sure the numbering makes sense. If you think this task sounds like a form of meditative exercise, you're catching on. Messages move here like winter sunshine, deliberate, rare, and glad to have made the journey at all. When someone wants a book from a locked press, he doesn't shout through the room. He raises a finger like a modest lighthouse. The armorius sees, nods, and ambles to a cupboard with the correct gravity. Labels on the shelves are not entirely reliable, because the labeler had a complicated relationship with sorting by subject versus size, and women and men have argued less happily over less. Instead, there is memory. Brother Osbert knows the Augustine that smells faintly of smoke because it spent 1 damp season near the kitchen. Brother Cuthbert knows the book of homilies that contains a pressed sprig of rue, placed there by an herbalist who needed a bookmark with ambitions. The catalog helps too. It is a list of list titles, donors, the year a volume learned to be itself. When a book is removed, a wooden board called a liber vacus stays behind to mark the absence like a placeholder of conscience. In the modern world, we would call this a checkout card, but wood does the scolding more effectively than paper. At noon, the library remembers that it is within a monastery and that monasteries obey bells with professional skill. Readers fold pages, not corners. They put pencils they do not own into drawers with all the respect due to other people's saints. Doors close gently because hinges have feelings in old buildings. The meal takes place elsewhere with beans and bread, but the library keeps the silence like an entrusted letter. Afternoons are for repair. A split seam is sewn with linen that refuses to panic. Glue warms in a pot that is also used for nothing else, but which every monk suspects is sometimes borrowed by the illuminator to affix gold. Margins that suffered commentary with too much enthusiasm are scraped gently with a knife that makes no promises. The chain receives oil. A small boy, future prior, present errand, carries a bundle of returned books like a little funeral, which is to say respectfully and with excellent posture. Outside, a cart rattles in the yard. Its driver has brought a barrel of lamp oil. and 3 bundles of parchment from a tannery that offers a humble discount for pious customers and exact weights by the cord. Travel is rare for these volumes, but not unknown. Sometimes a book is lent to a neighboring house for a specified season, like a good tenor or a sturdy plow. The agreement is written on 2 parts of the same sheet, cut along a wavy line so that only the jagged edges will later reunite. This is called a chirograph, and it is the medieval version of 2-factor authentication, except you cannot forget your edge in the laundry. Another time, a scholar from across the sea arrives with letters that praise him elaborately and explain, with many compliments, his desire to copy the text no one else seems to have. The armorist reads these letters with a straight face and agrees, and then escorts the scholar to a desk within easy listening distance of the chain. Backups are made the same way as primaries, 1 letter at a time, with a pen that must be sharpened more frequently than the mind. If the book leaves the monastery at all, it travels in a chest like a clerk on official business and gathers dust as proof of distance. The rules are simple and precise like a square. You may not borrow a book without promising something whose loss will hurt more than the loss of the book money, reputation, an oath that mentions saints by name. You may not annotate the margins unless you are copying official glosses, in which case you must write as if your handwriting once took vows. You may not test irons on parchment. This rule is so specific it must have been needed. Candles belong in holders with dishes that can catch regret before it becomes circular. No one may lick a finger to turn a page, because parchment remembers everything and forgives very slowly. If you sneeze on Augustine, you apologize to Augustine. Penalties exist, but they read like rescue rather than revenge. An extra hour in the scriptorium binding repairs on Saturday, or if the offense is lofty, the copying. By hand of a set of homilies about patience, a punishment that is also a personality. Economy here is a quiet barter among friends. A fisherman's widow gives the abbey a jar of lamp oil in exchange for a book of sermons visited once a week by her priest. The oil keeps the letters alive after dark. A carpenter mends a press and receives the use of the library door for carving practice on feast eves. The illuminator borrows for a single day a bestiary's image of a lion to copy into a lord's psalter. In return, he puts a little lion into the margin of the monastery's own calendar, looking out at Lent, with an expression we can call supportive. When a book tears, a small new piece is laced in, and the scar becomes part of the narrative, like a chapter with stitches. You can tell the age of a community by the number of its mended corners. The richest treasure is not a gilded page, but a clean list, a catalog with every book accounted for, and a note that Brother Matthew's grammar returned from St. Botolph's in good health and slightly improved spelling. Toward evening, a messenger arrives with a parcel tied in twine that curves the way time does at vespers. Inside rests a new acquisition, which is to say something copied last year but read first today, the life of a saint who disliked geese, or a commentary that enjoys adjectives, or a small astronomical treatise that insists the stars behave politely. The unpacking is the closest thing this library knows to applause. The armorist checks the choirs to see if the gatherings are singing from the same page. He shakes the volume gently. If it's a good binding, it will not rattle hope. A donation note is carefully written, with the donor's name spelled according to his own confidence. The chain is attached, and the book is led to its desk like a horse that does not mind stables. Its neighbors make room without fuss. Someone reads the first sentence aloud just to hear how it sounds in the room. It sounds exactly like it belongs, because this is how belonging is made. Night establishes itself without ceremony. The last readers close their books and fold their bodies back into silence. The candle in the brass dish declines its own flame. Smoke rises as if the air is taking a note. Keys reverse their day. On the way out, the armorist looks again at the catalog and adds one line that is both fact and fiction. Received on the feast of St. Martin, bound in red, edges faintly blue. He could have written more the mood of the scribe, the number of winter afternoons stored in the margins, but librarians are frugal, even with poetry. The door clicked shut with the sound that doors made before they discovered how to complain. The keys return to the prior, who says "Dio gratias" with the tone of someone who means it and also appreciates a countable outcome. In the dormitory, the copyists shake ink from their fingers as if they are releasing little stars. Morning after morning, the ritual repeats, and over the decades, small changes accumulate like dust that no one resents. A new shelf arrives, donated by a local noble whose arms will be painted subtly on the end panel where they cannot warp learning. A novice invents a system of shelf marks that combine numbers and letters in a manner later historians will praise, because praise is what numbers crave. Someone experiments with a dab of vinegar to remove a mold bloom and discovers, with resigned wisdom, that vinegar prefers salad. Another brother writes an exceptionally beautiful hand and becomes a kind of rumor. Visitors ask to see the book he wrote as if it contains a personal temperature. Through winters, vellum crackles faintly when pressed. Through summers, it relaxes like laundry. The chains continue to speak their brief sentences, and when one breaks, it is mended without editorial comment. Modern readers might ask whether all this slowness ever concerned the people who practiced it. The answer is surprisingly administrative. The schedule fit the tools, and the tools fit the patience available, which was ample. Books traveled so that memory did not have to run at a sprint. Catalogs grew so that panic could stay small. Rules existed to prevent the sort of plot that keeps you awake. The monastery did not fear change. It feared misplacing things. If you think of a server room humming in blue light, you aren't far off, except the backups are entirely analog and smell like tallow. The Armorias is an early systems administrator with more daylight and fewer users, and when a book crashes, it is because it fell. And the recovery protocol is glue pressure and a prayer that specifies no miracles but does not object to them. A small micro-chronicle to close gently. One winter, a fox wandered into the yard and stared through the library window with the expression of an auditor who has misplaced his pen. A brother copied the fox into the margin of a sermon about vigilance. A century later, another brother found the fox and added a tiny collar, perhaps because he believed in continuity. Centuries after that, a curator in clean gloves smiled at both of them and wrote a note on acid-free paper describing a fox of uncertain theological commitment. The chain, unaffected by all this biography, continued to do what chains do: keep the book in the world by keeping it in its place. If you have drifted, the room will keep reading without you. Keys will find their hooks, glue will remember where it hardens best, and catalogs will add another line about another volume that smells faintly of rain. The monks will continue to turn pages with dry fingers, and the chains will continue to end their soft sentences with the same period as always. Somewhere a candle will make a little lake in its brass dish, and in the morning someone will peel the cooled wax out in one satisfying curve. No drama arrives, no plot insists. Only the quiet arithmetic of a library that counts without hurry. One desk, one book, one reader, one bell, and the very long memory of a room that specialized in not forgetting. You might not think the most eventful object in a kitchen drawer would be a small oval of metal with a handle, but the teaspoon has been patiently collecting human history one gentle scoop at a time. It sits there, neither heroic nor shy, waiting for tea that may or may not arrive on schedule, which between us tea often doesn't. If you're still awake by the time we get to municipal regulations on spoon weights, feel free to subscribe for more bedtime bureaucracy. But please don't strain anything. For now, let's drift into the life of a teaspoon, from the moment metal cools and decides to be useful, to the quiet clink it makes against a cup, the way a polite door taps before entering. The spoon has no plot. It prefers routines, which is why it pairs so well with sleep. It begins in a heat so bright it forgets to have a color. In a workshop that smells like fresh charcoal and resigned leather, a founder pours molten metal into a mold that looks like a long sigh. Silver if you could afford it, pewter if you couldn't, brass if you were hopeful, nickel silver if you were optimistic without evidence. The mold halves close like a handshake that already happened. Somewhere a boy with a bucket of sand regards the operation with the mild concern of a person who has recently been told not to touch anything for the rest of the afternoon. When the metal cools, a raw spoon emerges with a spine along its edge, like a memory of lava and a sprue, an extra umbilical of metal that must be cut away with a snip that sounds like blame removed from a sentence. Files hum. The bowl is shaped on a stake anvil, a rounded iron cousin that has supported generations of politely curved things. A hammer the size of a well-behaved potato taps the bowl until light runs evenly across it. This is called planishing, a word that feels like smoothing a bedsheet with the back of the hand. Every few spoons, the smith pauses to line them up as if taking attendance. They do not speak. They gleam the way attention does just before it forgets itself. Marks come next, the spoon's tattoos, its small resume engraved near the neck where only curious people will look. In London, the assay office once used a leopard's head. In Paris, Minerva showed up for silver. In Moscow, St. George sometimes leaned in with the calm of a man who has defeated a dragon and is now inspecting cutlery. These hallmarks were not romantic. They were practical anesthesia against fraud. A town could demand that a teaspoon weigh at least so many pennyweights, so the public wouldn't feel cheated out of an invisible fraction of metal while stirring. This made the teaspoon a tiny citizen, registered by punches that struck with enough conviction to outlast wars, fashions, and whatever we call the period when everyone thought putting pineapples on everything was a plan. The maker's mark might be 2 letters, or a symbol, an acorn, a sun, a pair of crossed spoons that looked like a gentle duel with no winner and only clean cups as casualties. Inspectors kept ledgers on spoons the way botanists keep notes on extremely cooperative leaves. If you are wondering whether somebody somewhere tried to shave the rim of a silver spoon to harvest wealth, 1 teaspoon of dust at a time, yes, of course, and yes, they were fined. Honestly, the audacity was the heaviest thing in the room. A newly marked spoon must learn its job. This training takes place on a table where everything else already knows what to do. The teacup invites, the saucer agrees, the sugar bowl waits like a modest mountain, the cream jug arrives late because it is elegant and can, and the teaspoon stands at attention on the right-hand side, bowl facing up, because it is not hiding anything. Etiquette books, which were the social media of their day, but with fewer opinions about curtains, instructed that one should stir gently without wringing the sides, never lick the spoon, and always return it to the saucer so as to avoid escalation. Georgian hostesses measured civilization in decibels, specifically the absence of them, so the teaspoon perfected the silent orbit. A quarter turn clockwise, never clunk, no whirlpools. It's difficult to overstate how much historical serenity depends on not clattering. In cafes, women stirred sugar into coffee while pretending not to see, men pretending not to notice. In parlor rooms, a teaspoon was the mediator between hot water and patience, a small diplomat with no hat. Spoons traveled. They slipped into waistcoat pockets and shipping crates, rode in trunks lined with paper that knew about sea air, and migrated with families who owned more hopes than chairs. In colonial ports, teaspoons turned into currency so frequently that shopkeepers put prices in spoons as if economics itself came with a handle. One receipt from a New England general store reads, essentially, 3 pounds of nails, 1 length of ribbon, and 6 teaspoons fewer than yesterday. Brides once received sets so uniform they resembled identical cousins. Sailors carved handles from whalebone during calm weather when sky and water were being extremely repetitive. The 19th century manufactured spoons by the million and then got decorative. state spoons with state birds, regretfully enthusiastic, souvenir spoons with view holes in the finial, a built-in tiny keyhole to Niagara Falls, and commemorative spoons for events that did not require commemoration but received it anyway because spoons were ready, willing, and stackable. In one Nebraska fair, a spoonsmith boasted a record of 30 seconds per spoon. Across the world, a Japanese artisan took 30 days on one, hammered from shakudo, until the surface carried the kind of quiet that can convince you to speak softly to a utensil. But a teaspoon's working life is mostly domestic logistics. The drawer is its dormitory, a narrow place with dividers like the aisles of a very tidy orchard. Households develop spoon ecologies. There are the good spoons which come out for birthdays and arguments about the good spoons. The everyday spoons who know all the cereals by first name. The one slightly bent spoon that somehow became the family favorite because it fits a human mouth like an apology. And the small demitasse that lives near the coffee grinder like a field mouse near a granary. Hotels stockpile teaspoons the way airports stockpile chairs, just enough to pretend abundance and resign themselves to an attrition rate that suggests spoons reproduce in pockets. One London hotel ledger from the 1920s includes a penciled note, "Spoons migrating again. Speak with staff. Consider shorter teaspoons." This plan did not work. The teaspoons left anyway. Some cultures answer by tethering them with tiny chains in cafes, iron threads to deter absent-minded migration. The chain adds a soft clink of accountability each time sugar turns into sweetness. Washing spoons is a small ceremony that looks like dishwater but feels like maintenance of civilization. In sculleries, they clattered into wire baskets before diving into suds that smelled faintly of lemons that never knew they were involved. In big houses, a housemaid counted them as they went in and out with an attention usually reserved for jewels or guests. The silver ones turned black when oxygen grew too friendly. Then came the polishing, paste, cloth, circular motions, and the gradual revelation of a mirror in which nothing wants to see itself, but spoons politely allow it. The first time a child is trusted to wash the spoons without supervision is a promotion. The first time the same child is told not to put wet spoons back into the drawer because wood has opinions, that's education. Spoons survive most disasters. The plate may break, the cup may chip, but the spoon merely shrugs and continues being itself, which is a lesson worthy of a needlepoint if needlepoints were more practical and less floral. Repair is a normal chapter in a spoon's life. A snapped neck, rare but dramatic, goes to the smith like a soldier visiting a quiet doctor. A bent bowl from an enthusiastic ice cream incident meets a mallet on felt. The good spoons receive new ideas, monogram, M for mine, engraved in script that curves like steam. One Victorian fad cut holes in spoon bowls to make sugar sifters. This turned full spoons into perforated spoons, which are useful for dusting cakes and less useful for soup, a fact discovered several times despite warning labels near the cake. Meanwhile, etiquette updated itself without changing much. Stirring remained clockwise, clinking remained amateur, and putting a teaspoon back on the table instead of on the saucer remained the social equivalent of leaving a wet umbrella on a bed. Legal, but no one remembers you kindly. We think of teaspoons as consistent, but standardization is younger than you'd guess. In pharmacies, an apothecary's teaspoon once meant whatever the apothecary meant, which is why 18th century instructions read like wishes. Take 2 or 3 teaspoons of cordial as needed, and people did, with consequences that ranged from relieved to impressed to asleep. In the 20th century, public health posters gingerly suggested that a teaspoon equals 5 milliliters, and teaspoons gradually agreed to be 5 milliliters when measured by a reliable adult. Measuring spoons arrived to rescue recipes from family traditions such as a spoonful, but not the big spoon, and not Granny's spoon. The other one, which is exquisite poetry and poor chemistry. Now a drawer may hold two separate sovereignties, the eating teaspoons that aim for comfort and the measuring teaspoons that dream of accuracy. One set engraved 1 TSP and the other engraved with the marks of a marriage or an estate sale. Spoons also keep family history the way trees keep rings. A battered one with initials scratched by a left-handed relative explains more than a photograph. Another, with a nick from a kitchen sink in a household that moved frequently, carries a map of addresses under its sheen. The teaspoon believes in inheritance, not large sums, but reasonable continuities. When a grandmother says, "Take the spoons," she's bequeathing a slow instrument for adding sweetness to mornings. Auctions display them in rows that look like smiles practicing. Museums store them in drawers that glide like polite secrets. Curators pull a tray and whisper, "Ah, Hanoverian pattern, rat tail back," as if greeting friends by hairstyle. A great many spoons are anonymous, but they rarely feel so. Humans project stories onto them the way sunlight projects rectangles onto tables. There were spoon crimes, none of them urgent, all of them strangely memorable. A hotel registered a complaint in 1894 that a guest replaced silver teaspoons with convincing electroplate replicas. A heist so gentle one imagines apologies written in very good ink. A factory in Sheffield was fined for stamping sterling on spoons that were sterling in ambition only. The magistrate weighed one, frowned, and found the missing grams quietly reprehensible. In World War II, families turned silver into the government for aircraft and shells, then bought it back after victory in odd assortments, as if spoons had joined the military and returned with new friends. In siege times, teaspoons photographed themselves in ration book still lifes. In feast times, they reflected chandeliers that mistook themselves for constellations. Through it all, the spoon held its line: bring liquid to mouth, return to saucer, behave. Regional spoons picked their quirks. Russian teaspoons learned to crackle through sugar cubes held in teeth, producing a sound like faint applause in the mouth. Turkish spoons became small laurel leaves for tiny tulip-shaped glasses. The handle tops sometimes sprouted moons that did not wax or wane. In the Netherlands, coffee spoons were finials shaped like canal houses, tidy architecture you could stir with. In America, the 1890s invented commemorative spoons so aggressively that you could stir your tea with the Spanish American. War if you wanted, though it is unclear who did. In Japan, dessert spoons practiced understatement and let the ceramics speak. In India, tea stalls defaulted to stainless steel, the democratic metal, because it neither rusts nor pretends. All these differences solve the same problem with minor poetry, moving sweetness from one place to another. The teaspoon appears in literature the way extras appear in films present, reliable, occasionally promoted. T.S. Eliot measured out a life with coffee spoons, which is either a warning or an endorsement for routines, depending on your caffeine level. In diaries, people noted washing spoons as shorthand for a day that behaved. Rain in the morning, 6 spoons missing, called Mrs. Webb. In crime fiction, the poisoned sugar lumps implicate a spoon that never testifies. In children's stories, a spoon becomes a character because the fork was busy competing with a knife. Somewhere a historian wrote an article on the sociability of the teaspoon, and we can imagine the footnotes being more relaxed than usual. Even in the modern kitchen, where dishwashers exhale like small desalination plants and mugs outnumber plates, the teaspoon remains a unit of peace. You adjust a recipe by a half teaspoon, which is the culinary equivalent of saying please. You count medication by a measured teaspoon and consider yourself in dialogue with both your ancestors and the National Institutes of Health. You tackle a jar of honey with a teaspoon because a tablespoon would be a declaration and breakfast is not a battlefield. In office break rooms, spoons disappear into the mysterious ecology of communal kitchens and reappear in potted plants or next to the copier, as if mapping the territory. At midnight, A quiet person stands by a window, stirring a cup, and a neighbor hears the tiny orbit and thinks, tea, and goes to bed calmer than a headline suggested they would be. By now the drawer has closed again. The spoons lie shoulder to shoulder like a set of patient ideas, one with a bright spot where it rubs the divider, one with a slightly elongated bowl that must have spent a year in a cafe being misunderstood. If you lifted them, they would weigh less than your attention, but they hold the weight of countless small negotiations, sweeten or not, another sip or bed, talk or listen. The world has larger instruments, louder tools, heavier machinery. The teaspoon is not interested. It would like to continue its slow diplomacy between heat and tongue, between effort and comfort. You may measure a life in big things if you wish. The spoon will be here for the little ones, taking attendance. If you find yourself drifting, the spoon will finish the stir without you. It will rest on its saucer with the quiet confidence of an object that has already met tomorrow and found it manageable. In the morning, it will clink once, like a fingertip on a doorframe to say, I'm here. And then it will be here again, modestly, with sugar in its future and a drawer at night. No suspense arrives. No finale insists. Only the soft arithmetic of teaspoons persists. One scoop, one circle, one sigh of steam, and the very old pleasure of a sound so small it counts as silence. You might not expect romance to organize itself around a notice board and a stairwell bulb, but in the Soviet Union it often began there, on a landing that smelled faintly of microwaved cabbage and winter boots drying. The bulb hummed like a patient bee. A payphone clicked twice, which meant no one had coins. Snow folded the city into hush. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe for more tales of coat check, etiquette, and tram schedules, but honestly, don't tire yourself. The evening's first miracle is very small. A kettle on a hot plate where a brigade leaves teaspoons upside down to dry a roster pinned with blunt pins that lists who gets the rehearsal room and who gets the chess set. Komsomol corridors are long and generous with echoes. The dom culture after choir practice with sawdust and cordial ambition. A friend of a friend suggests a walk, which in context is not a walk, but the suggestion of a walk, a soft rectangle of time. There's no permit for walking, which is convenient, because permits try to become attached to things the way burrs attach to wool, and it is best to keep them off emotions. Notes slide under doors and wait under telephone books. Meet at the embankment at 6, and then a line that says no. Line, which is a joke about the queue that exists for everything else. The coat check auntie becomes a confidant without ever saying a word. She exchanges coat tags like tarot cards that always foretell weather and snacks. A cassette passes hand to hand because it is a little safer to confess with music than with adjectives. The tape contains a band that is almost allowed, and a song that says what a paragraph gently refuses to. In an era when privacy is something you schedule, the city supplies public places that feel private for exactly 12 minutes at a time. A tram stalls and becomes a tea room. A flyer advertises a lecture on coal and, by accident, the location of the nearest working light bulb. People learn to listen kindly and forget badly. A meeting may be postponed by snow or a sudden shortage of anything that can be short. Affection is patient the way bread is patient, it waits in a cloth. You ask what time it is, which translates to, are you free, which translates to yes for one. Turn around the block and an extra stop at the kiosk that sometimes sells oranges and sometimes sells nothing but the idea of oranges. The places arrange themselves like a polite constellation that the authorities pointed to and said, this way, walk here. And people agreed and also walked on the bridges and along the parks where benches learned names first. The Saturday dances are brave, a waltz that practiced all week not to bump into anybody's jacket, a twist learned from a cousin who saw it on television in a hotel lobby with the sound off, and then a very slow song to store courage for later. The embankment becomes the stage, the river acting as chaperone and applause. A kiosk window serves ice cream in winter because no one promised logic. Coins smell like iron in people's hands, and the vendor wipes the scoop with a cloth that believes in reincarnation. Benches keep secrets without being asked. Bridges collect promises and carefully do not write them down. There is a club with a piano that always remembers the key technically and the melody approximately. When the room gets crowded, a walk becomes a corridor with soft edges. On a better Saturday, the city grows a temporary countryside. An Electrica ticket produces a fence to lean on, a berry to stay in your mouth carefully, and a map that loosens around the dasha until every path looks like permission. Glasses fog and neighbors do not like punctuation. There are commas of conversation and long, unpunctuated stretches of potato digging. The return run counts curfew the way bakers count bread, carefully with a sense of yeast. The last train is never truly the last, but saying it is keeps everyone light on their feet. If the gate is shut, the station becomes the last scene of a play where the bench is suddenly promoted to guardian. Somewhere on the platform, a dog remembers everyone. The faintest smell of diesel mixes with dill, a national perfume. A scarf becomes a tablecloth. Oranges do a job with a brighter smell because roses are shy and rare. Cinema tickets turn into favors. You buy 2 in the morning and spend the day deciding who is invited into your evening. A scarf around a chair holds a place in the kind way that paper clips hold small countries of paper together. Even the wind knows which corner belongs to which pair of walkers, which lamppost hears which secret, which kiosk sells which flavor of hope. There are rules, and then there are rules. The small ones are generous. The large ones wear stamps. A stamp and a passport, the propiska chooses which district your evening may end in, which means romance learns to move along cliffs of jurisdiction without looking down. Patrols appear like weather, not malicious exactly, but confident that everyone owns too much air. The dorm attendant writes names with a pencil that does not break. The pencil knows that love stories need erasers more than sharpeners. Volunteer patrols look like helpful neighbors and act like the punctuation department of a novel, supplying commas where you did not expect them. Yet most nights, paper is on your side. A folded sheet answers questions faster than your mouth can. A student card fits behind a tram ticket with the snugness of bureaucracy relieved to be held properly. Privacy becomes a calendar arrangement. An early tram is private, a late walk is private. A lamp that fails on cue is essentially a curtain, and everyone knows how to whisper in the dark. Gifts happen because Cash discovers that it is awkward, and also that it has a smell. Oranges perform with a brighter accent. Genes say from the future without becoming dramatic about it. Polish chocolate counts as proof of care and proof of luck simultaneously. If someone produces nylon tights with a flourish, it means something kind is happening, probably a promise that will hold long enough to become a habit. Cinema tickets become invitations disguised as paper rectangles. Their corners flatten in pockets as if to make carrying them easier on hearts. There is a rule about not showing wealth because wealth is rare and easily mistaken for crime. There is a rule about not showing need because need is common and easily mistaken for complaint. So gifts curve in like comets brief, sparkling, and technically unrelated to economics. Meanwhile, refrigerators whistle mythologies, stairwells echo with shoes trying to be quiet, and the coat check ante maintains a ledger that would embarrass the state with its accuracy if anyone ever compared them. People go on dates that are technically grocery runs. They carry beats like bouquets and compare price lists the way others compare poems. The phrase, just a walk, expands to include 1,000 lawful details that somehow add up to feeling seen. A scarf on a chair still holds the table. The bench still refuses to know names. Eventually, as reliable as a thermostat that's just been tapped, milestones arrive. Parents meet over tea in kitchens that seat 3 and hear 10. Voices stack like pancakes, and syrup is applied in the form of congratulations. The conversation performs the ceremony of asking and consent without ever admitting that anything romantic is happening, because romance is private and tea is public. A day at Zags's bows, brief speeches, and a Soviet champagne that fizzes exactly like Relief Audible, but not provocative. Photographs show boots and coats and a grin that ignores weather on principle. A registry clerk signs with a pen that has seen many memes and no surprises. If you follow, a one-room flat becomes a hall. Salads and toasts, a record player that wobbles kindly, a song that knows every kitchen by sight. Someone plugs the electric kettle into an outlet that jiggles like a loose tooth, and it still works. Because tea respects intention. Later come cues and forms, and the application that grows thicker while patience grows specific. Two families share walls and collect Sunday as if it were a hobby. Keys catch up with years. Doors teach their locks the names of their owners. Summer lists are paint, winter lists are coal and books and blankets. Furniture is acquired from cousins or from rumor. The door closes quietly because doors have learned discretion. Paper cups, voice low. Tomorrow is penciled in between work and a walk. And love continues to look like errands, a borrowed drill, a bag of buckwheat, a mirror carried up a stairwell with the help of a neighbor who pretends not to notice anything except gravity. Children appear like new clocks. They reset the room to the hour of bedtime and the minute of porridge. A city of millions remains the size of your tram stop, your grocery line, your kitchen table. If an appliance fails, it does so gently at night when most repairs are philosophical. If a promise meets a delay, the queue absorbs it and returns it when ready. The morning after any celebration, someone stands by a window with a cup and listens to the radiator argue with itself. The payphone clicks twice somewhere far away. Snow or rain performs the small constant theater of weather. Love shows up for its shift. It hangs the coats and takes a number and brings home bread. It persists slowly, deliberately, the way a city writes itself on shoes. If you're still with me, your pillow is probably warmer than the radiators ever were, which is an achievement. The stories stay small on purpose. A walk is never only a walk because the streets have opinions. A bench is never merely wood because it remembers. A gift is never simply a gift because the economy is shy. History hums like the stairwell bulb. People meet each other in ways that leave very little paper trail and very many crumbs on plates. They measure the day not in hours, but in tram intervals and the length of a queue. They talk without saying some things and say some things without noticing, which is the standard distribution of human communication everywhere. But here it's wrapped in scarves and stamped once politely by the city. If you drift now, the embankment will keep the last steps for you. The bench will keep the last sentence. The ticket will keep the time. In the morning, we can walk again, slowly, technically between destinations, practically toward each other, and very precisely across a bridge that refuses to write anything down. You might not expect the absence of a window to have a story, but the brick remembers. It remembers where sun used to arrive, and where an assessor stood for a moment, gloves folded into certainty, and made a tiny mark that changed a room's weather. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe for more riveting accounts of ancient ledgers and moderately clean glass, but truly, there's no rush. Nothing in tonight's topic moves quickly. The window tax, which visited England in the late 17th century and wandered through parts of Europe in friendly imitation, was a practical idea that learned to behave like a superstition. It declared, with paperwork's usual charm, that a house full of light must also be full of money. Light was treated as an invoice, and the sun, unconsulted, became a tax clerk with excellent hours. Assessors walked streets that still smelled. of horses and yeast, counting rectangles with a posture that suggested they had all afternoon. They carried notebooks whose pages were as brave as bread, receiving columns of tallies and names: Mr. Shaw, 7 lights. The Baker's Row corner, 9. The tavern with the shy sign, 11, and an argument about the cellar. Light on these pages meant an opening shaped like arithmetic. If a pane looked like 2, the assessor breathed in, considered the molding, and wrote 1 or 2 according to the weather of his conscience, the mood of a magistrate. Sometimes he tapped the glass, not for truth, but for rhythm. Windows that were accidentally open because spring had a good afternoon were briefly shut with a dignified cough. A few towns tried to create standardized shutters like uniforms so that the count would be easier, which is a little like teaching birds to cue. It did not work, but the shutters looked coordinated, the way a village looks coordinated during a harvest festival because everyone happens to own a hat. Counting happened from outside, which produced comedy in slow frame rate. Loopholes were found in carpenters' shops with the same materials used for chairs. There were half windows, quarter windows, windows that were not windows but a moral position on ventilation. Someone invented a slape, which was simply a slit that failed to meet the definition of a window, the way a creek fails to meet the definition of a river if the examiner happens to be thirsty. Born from the marriage of a tax and a tape measure came the phrase borrowed light, an opening on the inside wall, taking illumination from a permitted window the way one candle borrows from another. It was legal to inherit sunshine sideways. In some towns, builders designed rooms in long sequences like polite cousins, each borrowing from the last, so that the house glowed like a rumor traveling along a corridor. On foggy mornings, borrowed. Light became philosophical. A person could believe in it just as one believes in the honest intentions of soup warm present, not especially provable. Assessors soon developed a repertoire of squints. They learned the difference between a genuine casement and a pious rectangle of paint that insisted it was full of sky. Painted windows developed their own weather. Rain left polite lines down a brick facade where the picture had no gutters. If you saw a house with 9 windows and 3 pale, bricked squares like retired chessboards, you knew the tax had passed through, and the bricklayer had been paid by the hour. Asterisk, asterisk, because the law counted exteriors. The theater of compliance happened on streets. Families negotiated with their kitchens and with the smallest bedrooms, the way one negotiates with a luggage allowance. This room will keep its window and become the room of all ambitious tasks needing sewing, the daily invention of breakfast. That room will lose its window and become a repository for hats, silence, and onions. Doctors, decades later, wrote to newspapers with the exhausted tone of men who have counted lungs, saying that bricked windows made for bricked chess. A child who grows up in dimness, they said, becomes excellent at finding things by touch and learns to love doorways. Carpenters learned new vocabulary. The blind window, also called sham or dummy, became a fashionable untruth. It was a hole that had been filled, but kept its outline like a memory. Painters gave it a frame, sometimes a fake sash, occasionally a pet cat enjoying a painted sill. A house might develop a formal face, complete with eyebrows, because symmetry mattered more than sunlight. There were mansions that smiled politely at the road with 6 perfectly spaced lashes of masonry, 4 of which had been convinced not to exist. At night, someone always walked past and saw the moon striking a rectangle that refused to participate. They felt as one does in a library when a book-shaped gap sits on the shelf. A small gravity toward absence. Asterisk, asterisk, the tax delighted ledgers more. Then it delighted people, and it trained towns in quiet improvisations. There were kitchen windows that hinged from the top like advice. There were cellar lights that pretended to be drains. There were attic slits that were definitely for pigeons, no matter how many chairs were stored there, and they were stable. Apertures that did not count as windows because the horse did not vote. In cities with gossiping rivers, Paris tried aversion. The Low Countries and other merchants petitioned dramatically, and then quietly cut bricks where bricks were easiest to cut. A window is not a luxury, one pamphlet muttered. It is simply the proof that one prefers to see where the spoon is going. The pamphlet was confiscated, as spoons rarely require political context. Meanwhile, the market for glass developed a weather of its own. Glaziers discovered that even if houses bought fewer panes, they bought better ones. The fashionable thing, if you must reduce count, is to enlarge the survivors until they look like calm lakes. One grand townhouse closed 6 small eyes and opened 2 grand ones, so the front looked permanently astonished. A microeconomy arose in which the rich negotiated exemptions by classifying certain openings as stairwell respirations, which is an expression you may whisper if you ever need to sound important in an empty hallway. Poorer streets looked like sheet music with many rests, a bar of brick, a bar of glass, a bar of wishful thinking. Innkeepers made the best of it. They wrote in brochures. Brochures were conversations with strangers, pinned to tavern doors, that their rooms were well aired, which meant there was a window in the corridor that one could borrow like a book. The rhythm of the day adjusted not only to the sun, but to the schedule of counting. Assessors preferred mornings because light misbehaves in the afternoon. Housewives preferred afternoons because bread misbehaves in the morning. Compromise that. Universal technology set the time at 11, with grace to 12 if the assessor broke his pencil. People grew fond of their shutters. A well-made shutter thudded with the authority of private life. Some towns required shutters to be open on certain holy days, which made the streets look like they had woken with lashes lifted. On tax day, shutters were shy. There were stories, repeated the way people repeat recipes in different kitchens until they come out tasting the same, about households keeping a spare shutter ready to swing over an extra window if a knock sounded. Imagine a family rehearsing. This. One person lifts the bar, another clicks the iron, somebody coughs onto a handkerchief to fill the silence during which the assessor counts. The performance lasted 6 seconds. The applause was strictly internal, and still, the state collected. It is what states do. The money went to things that make sense if you write them in a budget wars. Debts, a comforting idea that arithmetic cancels nuisance. It did not, of course. Nuisance turns up for work with or without a paycheck dot by the time the 18th century had learned how to wear wigs without irony. The medical pamphlets had multiplied like winter stockings. Open the window, they advised, and were answered by an accountant's cough. A physician named Buchan Scottish, stern in a gentle way, recommended air, as if it were a medicine that needed no apothecary. He did not mention the invoice that the air might bring. Town councils debated the tax and agreed with each other and also disagreed with themselves. There were exemptions for hospitals that acted like permissions for honest breathing. Workhouses sometimes qualified for reductions if they could prove that hope needed light. The legal phrase for this was not hope. It was something crisp and forgettable. The effect, however, was exactly that. A window opened and the room remembered how to be a room. The poor, a magistrate wrote, should not be made to pay for what God delivers by the hour, which was a lovely thought recorded at 10 in the morning and apparently misplaced before lunch. One village solved its dispute by moving the count to midsummer noon, when even a bricked window can't resist glowing faintly, a decision that enraged nobody because rage is a winter sport. Gradually, the tax fell out of fashion the way certain collars do, widely, with relief, and accompanied by a drawer full of obsolete apparatus. New taxes arrived, wearing more modern coats, and the window tax retired to the architecture. It left behind ghost windows, which you can still see if you like slow hobbies. Look up at a Georgian facade on a day when your errands are not urgent. Count the symmetrical promise of openings. Notice where the brick is a shade younger, where a sill is present without a pane, where a painter has continued to repaint a rectangle out of loyalty to the original idea. In some streets, false windows still make eye contact with you, practicing the social skill of buildings. An old pub might have a faux second-story window in which someone, a century ago, painted a potted geranium that never wilted. To save on candles, shopkeepers learned to love shop fronts like aquariums. A tailor in Bath redesigned his doorway to be a window that the law, too polite to argue with architecture, called a door. Designers learned tricks with light that we call daylighting, which sounds modern but is simply a legal way to admire the sky indoors. France developed its own variations. So did parts of Italy. In some mountain towns, the entire front of a house became a barn door that could be counted as an entrance rather than a light. The sun entered like livestock, and no one filled in the form. Funny thing about history is how it stores its jokes in masonry. The phrase daylight robbery, which people enjoy using when a sandwich costs more than expected, is probably not about the window tax, but it behaves as if it wants to be. The timing is tempting. The metaphor is too comfortable. Linguistic caution shakes its head gently and asks for evidence. Still, the expression keeps strolling alongside the tax, like a cousin of the family story who insists he was present at the famous incident with the cow, although records suggest he was born later that afternoon. Meanwhile, bricklayers became accidental memorialists. Their work filling holes the way a librarian fills gaps in a catalog remains in place. Walking a London street, you can spot the patchwork, the blushes of different clay, the vertical scar where a frame used to meet a threshold. In villages, children once counted bricked windows on their way to school, the way modern children count red cars. It gave them a feeling of competence about the past. Here is where money triumphed over light. Here is where light tried again tomorrow. Architects are not strictly poets, but sometimes they leave you a rhyme, a real window opposite a blind one, so that the facade keeps its COUPL, it stop by now. Rooms have discovered electric bulbs and pressures of air and double, glazing that is so competent and it makes sound look for other roots. Yet in older houses, the choreography still shows. Bedrooms that lost their windows became closets with good memories. Corridors remain wider where they once fed borrowed light. In attics, the shape of a dormer hints at a dispute that ended before your grandparents retired. Museums sometimes stage a window tax room with a bricked rectangle, a wooden bench, and an official notice that uses the kind of punctuation that could tuck in a child. The notice will explain thresholds of taxation 10 windows free, 11. Taxable, and you will feel a momentary, thrilling pity for the family that accidentally crossed the line by falling in love with daylight one time too many. In archives, you can request the ledgers, heavy as bread again, and find a surname that lived under 13 lights for 3 winters and then under 10. When that family moved, the new ledger wrote 12, which means an argument with brick, or a baby that became a teenager who needed his own rectangle. The ledgers rarely say, "It is easy to imagine everyone of the period living in darkness like candles under a hat." They did not. Humans remain inventive whether taxed or not. Mirrors multiplied. Courtyards opened. Whitewash gleamed with the friendliness of inexpensive stars. Because glass was dear, people cleaned it with the sincerity of a vow. In muddy seasons, there were stories of neighbors entering each other's kitchens specifically to admire a pane, so clean that it briefly ceased to exist. Sailors brought home odd bits of lens and prism. Children strapped them to sunbeams to write rainbows on the ceiling, a domestic rebellion that harmed no legislation. The window tax ended, but the habit of compromise continued, which is another way of describing civilization. Somewhere in a quiet town, a blind window still pretends for the sake of the street's symmetry, the way a person smiles in a group photograph, even if they weren't sure they'd keep the print. When it rains, the pretend sill glistens like a memory doing its best. And if, passing late, you think you see someone standing behind that wall, don't worry. You are only looking at masonry, remembering its career as light. If you have drifted at any point perhaps during the second mention of shutters, or when stairwell respirations opened its sensible little briefcase, then the tax has finally served a kind purpose. It was always an argument between ledger and sky, between counting and looking. The compromise produced bricked squares that make buildings look intentional even in their absences. It produced architects who learned to cheat brilliantly, and doctors who learned to nag kindly, and families who moved their chairs 2 feet toward or away from a rectangle and called it renovation. Tonight, those rectangles lie quietly in the dark, both the honest ones and the ghostly ones. The assessors have long ago put away their pencils, which means the morning will belong to the windows entirely. The sun will tick its way across the brickwork, lingering on the places where glass used to live, and the walls will pretend not to be flattered. You can sleep now. The set of the facade won't change, and if you need to count something, there are exactly as many blind windows as there are small, satisfied silences in a long street at dawn. You might not expect romance to sound like a stairwell bulb buzzing to life, but in the Soviet Union, it often did. The bulb hummed for exactly long enough to find your boots, your scarf, and the door handle that preferred to stick on humid days. If you're still awake by the time I reach the part about registration offices and ceremonial ferns, you're welcome to subscribe or simply roll over and let the paperwork tuck you in. Dating, as most ordinary things did, began with corridors, the long indoor streets of factories, dormitories, institutes, and Komsomol clubs that learned to echo voices without judging them. A notice board held more biographies than any library card catalog. Volleyball on Thursdays. Choir after shift. Physics circle, no prayer physics required. The kettle in the office kitchenette boiled like an optimist. A friend of a friend said the new typist liked poetry that rhymed, which narrowed it down to thousands. A rehearsal at the Dom Culture ended, and the coat check auntie who knew everyone's names and 3 pieces of gossip. A piece handed out scarves with a blessing disguised as a shrug. Couples formed in brigades because brigades were already organized for the purpose of carrying heavy things. A pair learned to walk home at the speed of 2 ration lines, stacked end to end, which is to say, unhurried and not without purpose. He borrowed a joke from the wall newspaper. She pretended not to know it, the way one pretends not to notice bread is fresh, because noticing might make it vanish. The evening's permission was written in the air like steam from a canteen bowl. Messages traveled slowly, which gave them time to fold themselves into better shapes. Phones in dorm halls asked for coins, then for patience. A call could begin with a click and end with the sudden crash of a neighbor's laughter. People developed techniques. Let it ring twice, then hang up, then ring again. This meant I am downstairs. Please be a legend. Libraries were equal parts learning and logistics. You left a note in Dostoevsky because your person would check Dostoevsky, and because the librarian favored detectives, but kept an open mind about crime and punishment. A library drawer contained index cards and 1 small fortune. Meet at the tram stop with the crooked lamp. Bring mittens. Tapes were passports for feelings. A song said what a paragraph could not, and a borrowed cassette could make 3 laps around an institute before anyone dared to record over it with a lecture. At dances, someone's cousin brought a reel-to-reel that needed 4 strong agreements and 1 outlet. The slow numbers were not especially slow. They simply took their time landing. On the way back, a tram stalled just long enough for tea and paper cups, which made one ride into a walk that happened to move. The city cooperated by laying out its park benches in pairs like punctuation marks. A bench is an equal sign for strangers, a tiny treaty signed by elbows dot places understood their job. Parks kept their paths sedate on Saturdays. The embankment coached the river to be profound in a whispering way, the way an uncle tells a joke that is actually advice. Couples practiced the choreography of walking and stopping like chess pieces that have agreed to call every move a draw. Clubs offered official reasons to see each other again. You could be in a chess club without touching a knight, or a film club where the projector was 10 minutes late and the discussion, which could not be late, began with the tea. An ice cream window at the Stolovaya slid open. Coins clinked. A young man declared his intentions with 2 scoops of plombier and a spare spoon. Bridges played host kindly, knowing that they would neither pry nor report. On gray days, people visited museums, not to look at canvases, although those behaved handsomely, but because a ticket was a contract for 2 hours of warm, quiet thinking together. Microclimates formed, the universal hush of a coat room, the ringing acoustics of a stairwell where someone practiced guitar on the 3 chords the century truly required. In every city, there was a payphone that worked too well. It became a matchmaker simply by faithfully connecting whoever had the correct coins and the correct boldness. A fair number of engagements began with the sentence, "Hold on. I will call you right back," which is also a comment on long-distance wiring. Further out, suburban trains, the electric-y, learned the rhythms of courtship without asking. You bought tickets that looked like stubs from a raffle, and you won a seat with a view of birches that reappeared so reliably you grew fond of their punctuality. Boys pretended to read newspapers. Girls pretended not to have snacks, and then did. Whole compartments smelled like apples and pencil shavings. On Fridays, half the city rode toward daishas and relatives and small fences that asked nothing of the world. If a couple was newly minted, the return run on Sunday was a slow meter that honored the fact, counting down stations like promises made reasonable. A missed stop became a parable that nobody told in a hurry. The bench at a small station in the dusk was as good as a chaperone. The wind agreed to supervise. If you timed it just right, the train doors exhaled a warm gust like a discreet congratulations. People appreciated privacy, which meant they practiced it publicly. 2 pairs of hands on a shared thermos. 2 noses braving the same fog. A conversation held at the specific volume that belongs to snow. Borrowed light from a platform lamp polished ideas that were not quite sentences. Somewhere an accordion tried to assemble a waltz out of gloves and memory. The art of being together consisted mostly of being together. All this happened inside, rules that were as ordinary as furniture and as mobile as chairs. The Propiska stamp and a passport explained which district believed you existed after dark. It did not feel like a romance device, and yet it was. A date ended by the time a doorman's shift ended, or it didn't begin because a dorm attendant had a lab pencil and a keen sense of midnight. The militia patrolled in a way that was habit more than alarm. They had winter cheeks and notebooks that preferred surnames to first names. You learned the geography of doors that opened and doors that opened with persuasion. Volunteer patrols appeared like weather, a good-natured storm in armbands. It was not particularly tragic. It was simply choreography. The phrase "let's walk" contained a knowledge of staircases, courtyards, and which benches held their warmth after 9. Kiosks kept hours that agreed with courtship, postcards until closing. Soda water when the tap felt generous. Carnations from a vendor who knew how much nerve a young man had used up already. There were rules about not disturbing neighbors, which brave teenagers interpreted to mean speak softly and get better at sign language. The city's walls learned a whole vocabulary of nods. Everyone practiced being inconspicuous with the diligence of students revising grammar. Cash was a sincere but sometimes absent friend, so gifts became an economy of charm. Flowers mattered and came in the numbers that etiquette had decreed. Roses were rare enough to make a hallway smell like a festival, and carnations did the job with a brighter red that looked like an apology folded into joy. Oranges interested everyone precisely because they were seasonal and therefore emotional. Polish chocolate carried foreign dignity and a covert message. I thought ahead. Jeans, if presented, turned into a saga that would be whispered to cousins for 3 Easters. A cinema ticket was 2 hours of official darkness. A scarf placed over the back of a chair meant the seat, and also the sentiment were taken. Deficit trained creativity. A knit hat, given with comedy, could be a love letter if it fit. The gift of fixing something was fashionable. A radio that played only one station now played 2. A kettle that whistled like a disappointed relative now whistled like a satisfied one. Even a good place in a queue, reserved with the seriousness of a treaty, was a gift. You stood for oranges early, survived strangers becoming acquaintances, and returned with success to the person who had slept in. The citizen as courier of kindness. This was a popular role. Microhooks punctuated the days. A tram driver who waited an extra second for a couple running hand in hand. A stranger who said, I saw you at the dance, and was not wrong. An umbrella that turned 3 into a community. On paper, dating obeyed calendars. Off paper, it obeyed weather and kitchen tables. A visit to parents happened in kitchens that knew how to seat 3 and hear 10. The table wore a cloth that had seen more conversations than comedies see audiences. Photos came out, boots polishing the winter, cousins posing with a pioneer flag, the universally beloved dog whose name had been repeated until even the clock knew it. Parents enjoyed the sport of testing humor. He fetched more bread from the downstairs neighbor, the bread friend, as everyone pretended to call him, and returned with 4 stories and a new opinion about sock darning. She answered questions about institute and work and whether she liked mornings. Like, was a careful word? The record player wobbled kindly. Someone produced a jar labeled compote in a handwriting that couldn't frown. Everything important was unhurried and therefore survivable. A proposal did not always look like a proposal. Sometimes it sounded like, let's file papers, which is not romantic if you translate it into any language, and yet in that time and place it was a bouquet with extra ribbon. The Civil Registry Office Act stood ready with officials, pens, and greenery that treated every couple as a new paragraph. The day at Zaggy's looked like a civic holiday that had put on polite shoes. There was a photograph with the obligatory fern, a speech that remembered the future politely, and champagne that fizzed in a way that yearned to be relief. Buildings designed for paperwork learned to hum softly for vows. Friends brought a loaf to be salted and shared, because blessing is also snack. A taxi was found by bribing the problem with optimism. A photo captured everything but the smell of wool in winter, which is always the missing detail. The reception happened in an apartment that folded itself into hospitality by moving furniture the way a chessboard moves pawns. The good plates came out like medals. Neighbors who were also relatives, who were also friends, rotated through as if on a municipal timetable. One room took the coats and secretly fell in love with the weight of them. Another room took the gifts and developed a gratitude that smelled faintly of oranges and varnish. Someone made a toast that involved the building's plumbing and the year's harvest. It sounded like a metaphor because everything did. In courtyards, little generals of snow organized themselves into retreat. After the ceremony, the long morning after began, which in the Soviet Union mostly meant a stroll through logistics. An apartment application grew thicker in a folder that developed the quiet pride of a family member. Queues, previously athletic, settled into long-distance mode. 2 families shared walls and the philosophies that come with them. On Sundays, the queue for books seemed to move faster because Hope had dressed up. Summer lists were paint. Winter lists were coal and blankets. Autumn lists were school shoes and one pencil that would perform 3 lives. The door of the future was heavy, but not locked. You pushed together. Many couples perfected the art of future tense. Tomorrow we will stop by the union committee. Next month we will ask about the housing lottery. As soon as we can, we will buy a lamp shaped like a question mark. Privacy was practiced through routine, quiet shoes, notes left on the kitchen shelf. Radios turned just loud enough to convince neighbors the news was the most important thing. And still, romance kept happening at human scale tea and dimpled glasses. A shared joke about the president's eyebrows, a coat mended so well the hole could no longer remember its shape. Work shifts alternated like polite waves. Evenings met again on stairs that trusted the light bulb to hum on cue. People dated by walking, by waiting, by promising to meet again at places that never tired of holding witnesses. They learned to put feelings into objects because objects could legally travel. A slice of cake in a pocket napkin meant I wanted you there. A postcard from Sochi with a slightly smug photograph of palms meant I stood in line for this and also for you. Even weather joined the conspiracy. Soft rain promoted umbrellas to intimacy, and hard frost made cheeks look honestly excited. When someone went to military service, letters left the city like small trains, each envelope an overnight bag packed with a month of news. They were read in barracks that remembered who had penned them because the handwriting smelled faintly of soap or lilac. If a letter went astray, the next one included a summary that sounded like an apology to a teacher. As previously discussed, your cousin's new accordion. My attempt at dumplings, the rumor about 2 more trams on our line. People saved these things in shoe boxes that had no intention of ever seeing shoes again. The quiet economy of affection taught everyone to measure abundance differently. A good clerk at a grocery felt like fortune. A neighbor with a drill was a patron saint. A child's winter coat that could be lengthened with a clever hem was a paragraph in a love letter written to the household. Dating folded into marriage as calmly as tea follows sugar. Not always. Nothing is always, but often enough to be recognizable even to strangers. Visiting friends, you recognize the pattern. A drying rack like a flag of daily life. A calendar with 3 birthdays circled and 1 penciled. A table that could become twice itself with a leaf that descended like a bridge. Micro-hugs continued to light the days. A TV announcer pronouncing a foreign name with heroic accuracy. A full jar of pickles becoming empty at the pace of a story. A neighbor child learning to tie skates in a hallway that smelled like winter cabinets. Years later. Those who grew up with stairwell bulbs and paper cups tell stories as gently as if remembering a library. The corridors sounded metallic, they say, but the conversations were warm. Couples met because the world was made of routines, and routines arranged meetings the way tides arrange shells. There were obstacles. There are always obstacles. But the method for overcoming most of them was persistence and a good coat. Many married for love. Many married for custom and discovered love in the pantry where the jam was. When shortages arrived, humor picked up extra shifts. When lines stretched, people compared recipes and opinions and quietly decided not to be enemies. The grand myths of the century, the slogans and statues, stood outside like weather. Inside, someone poured tea. Ask older people, and they will smile in a way that makes time feel like a well-cooked cabbage roll. Humble, sustaining, better than you remember. Ask them where they went on a first date, and they will likely name a bench, a bridge, a club with a projector that liked to think. Ask them what they said, and they will likely report nothing special. Then they will tell you something perfect, like, we walked. And you will understand the whole philosophy. If your eyes are heavy now, let them. The payphone on the corner has already clicked twice. Someone has promised to call back. The stairwell bulb was doing its single heroic job. Somewhere a domovoi, the little house spirit grandmothers kept in their vocabulary, has been bribed with a piece of candy to keep the kettle from boiling over while two people come back from the cinema. The electrica sighs into a station and waits long enough for a final sentence. Benches lean their noses toward warm hands. A door closes with the gentle authority of a day that did what it could. Love, in that time and place, was not a search but a schedule signals, walks, gifts that were sensible and miraculous in the same breath. It moved at the pace of a city that knew how to cue and how to keep a secret. Tomorrow we'll repeat these steps with small variations, another song on the tape, another bouquet from the vendor who knows everything, another stamp in a passport that watched the hour and approved. Sleep now. The kettle's lid is rattling softly, and the fern it zags as still as a photograph. You might not expect the sound of a wooden scale pan settling at dawn to be the heartbeat of a town, but for centuries it was exactly that, a quiet thud that told bakers how generous to be and told buyers how far a coin could walk. If you're still awake in a few minutes and you remember any of this in the morning market of your own kitchen, feel free to subscribe or just let the topic drift off like flour and lamplight. The assize of bread and ale sounds stern because it was, but its daily theater was almost drowsy. A clerk with cold fingers, a bell that rang with the patience of wet rope, a bench, a loaf, a rod, and a list. Every list, however brave, began with grain. The town's grain meters were mourning people by necessity. They measured wheat that had slept in sacks and oats that would rather be porridge. Standard bushels were kept like holy objects, great wooden tubs with iron hoops, occasionally baptized in the presence of witnesses who were also neighbors. They were inverted and emptied and tapped with a little mallet, so no one could hide luck in the corners. Prices arrived with the carts. A good harvest made numbers walk downhill. A hard year made them climb with hands on knees. Somewhere a clerk copied the week's price into a roll with a goose quill that didn't understand drama. He wrote, "Wheat at X shillings the quarter," and by writing it, he quietly tuned every oven in town. Bakers listened the way sailors listen to wind shifts. A loaf was not just a loaf. It was a weighed promise that adjusted itself to the weather in the fields and the rumor in the tavern. The rule was soothing in its arithmetic. When grain was dear, a farthing loaf got smaller but not mean. When grain was cheap, it grew plump in a way that made children practice gratitude with both hands. If anyone wonders why medieval documents list 72 official loaf weights, the answer is that commerce adores branches on a calm tree. The assize table translated price into weight like a lullaby does into sleep, steadily, repetitively, without new plot. Bakers kept pebbles in a bowl as reminders, one pebble for each notch on the table, because flour on paper is an argument, but a pebble on a shelf is a decision. Dough rose with the sun. Ovens woke like old animals, and paddles lifted with remembered choreography. A master cut 2 crosses on the top because superstition liked symmetry, and because the steam needed somewhere to leave politely. The whole day could be guessed from the loaf's color. A little pale, grain is dear. A little swaggering, grain is friendly. And in between, the world is its regular size. The market square learned to speak bread. Everyone carried a private library of weights in their hands, the feel of yesterday's farthing loaf, the memory of last year's famine loaf, the rumor of what the abbey was charging for its bake. If you bought 2, the second was often measured against the first with the seriousness of geometry. Ale kept pace like a cheerful cousin. The ale taster, yes, that was a job title with both responsibility and perks carried. A wooden cup and a small book and a face that could tell the difference between honest barley and ambition. He tasted not to be merry but to be regular, which is a different kind of civic virtue. A brewer's barrel was sealed with a chalk mark that said, in effect, "Tomorrow will not surprise you." The strangeness of it all, if you are still awake, is that this public fuss protected quiet dinners. A woman in a doorway with a knife and a slate didn't have to gamble. The loaf would be the size that arithmetic and winter allowed. Even the dogs learned what a lawful crust weighed. Somewhere somebody tried to cheat the square by weighing loaves warm when they carried their private weather of steam. The wardens were ready for that and waited till the loaves cooled. Because even fairness benefits from patience, enforcement in those towns was an oddly soft ritual that still managed to keep its pockets full of fines. The bread wardens elected, respectable, a little bored by their own dignity, walked with scales that had seen more porches than churches. They would step into a bakehouse with the authority of a coat on a peg. The master offered a loaf the way one offers a hat to the wind, hoping it comes back unflustered. Onto the pan it went with a thump that could be felt in the bones. A lawful loaf kissed the standard and said nothing more. An unlawful loaf tried to be charming and failed. The penalty might be a coin, a lecture, or, in energetic towns, a trip to the pillory where the offender got acquainted with public opinions and an unflattering hat. Most often, the warden shrugged and wrote a sum, and the baker nodded in a way that meant he would argue with the wheat tomorrow, not with men today. In many places, they kept a punishment loaf, a kind of ceremonial underweight specimen nailed to the wall as a warning. It gathered dust in a straight line and taught morality by example. Visitors think medieval markets were loud. Locals remember the hush between bargains. The assize added a rhythm that everyone respected. A bell in the guild hall rang when the price list changed, which is to say, not often and always decisively. People drifted toward the notice board at the speed of bread cooling, which is slow enough to be polite. Someone read aloud for those who could not read. Someone translated for those who could read numbers but not columns. The cloth dealers nodded because stability is the finest cloth. The fiddler took the hint and played something in common time, which the square approved. When a town had both a Jewish baker and a Christian baker, both followed the table, and both were grateful for the same reason. Fairness is bad at conversation, but excellent at hospitality. The smallest detail delights historians who refuse to sleep. In some boroughs, the official waits were chained to the table, not because they might run away, but because honesty likes to look domesticated as the century hands moved. Flour behaved according to the weather, but law behaved according to the lists. In a winter of short grain, the table shrank loaves to keep coins safe from panic. Everyone learned the art of the thin slice and the pride of the efficient stew. In a summer of easy grain, loaves became bold, and the town noticed that happiness can be measured in inches if you are patient. Bakers developed craftsmanly vanities about evenness. A row of loaves that looked like a row of bricks after a generous builder has visited. News traveled by crust. In the corner where apprentices traded opinions, someone always swore that Norwich used a lighter notch this week, or that York had revised its table with an optimism not shared by the Almighty. Clerks, for their part, traveled with folded copies of the assize like priests carry prayers, ready to set down in any parish and explain in a tone suitable for bedtime how a quarter of wheat turns into 16 legal weights that turn into one satisfied supper. If this puts you to sleep, the list has succeeded. There were misadventures. Some bakers added beans to stretch flour, a trick older than honesty. If done well, the result was edible and murmured prudence. If done badly, it squeaked betrayal between the teeth. The wardens knew the sound, and the grain meters knew the shade of the crumb that told on its maker like a child with jam. A few tried light hands on the scale, a gesture as old as trade itself. For them, the punishment escalated in classical sequence: fine, heavier fine, visible shame, and, if perseverance outran wisdom, banishment from the privilege of baking for a season, which is like forbidding a mill to turn. Some towns had a special basket called the God's Penny Loaf, a charitable weight baked on purpose for the poor. To cheat that basket was to invite a sermon that could sand furniture. Micro-historical delights lurk everywhere. A London ordinance once forbade bakers to sell warmed over. Bread is new because the second morning pretends to be the first. And law disapproves of imposters until carnival season by now. Perhaps your pillow is the Guildhall table and you are the clerk. He adjusts the candle, checks the chain on the bronze weight, breathes flour that behaves like weather and lungs, and writes another calm proclamation. He is a friend of ordinary afternoons. He knows that the assize is a truce between the field and the oven. He has a joke about foreigners who claim to sell bakers' dozens as a sign of generosity. He smiles because he knows the reason. In some places, the 13th role prevented accidental underweight and therefore prevented the wrath of wardens, who did not enjoy wrath any more than anyone else. He mends his quill. He draws a little line. He goes home to a table that obeys his own list. Somewhere ale is being judged not by poetry but by gravity. The taster dips his cup, declares it sound, and writes 2 words, good, fair, which are the 2 most ambitious adjectives in the medieval world. The morning after any market is the same in its goodness. Bread's gone, crumbs left like punctuation. Brewers rinse barrels with the thoroughness of sailors cleaning decks before a calm day. A boy runs weights back to their chains and has the satisfaction of hearing them clink home. Housewives turn farthing loaves into meals grander than the coins permit with onions, courage, and the militant kindness of herbs. The assize hangs in the air like a law that remembered to be useful. Even quarrels sleep when lists are respected. And now the centuries pass, and the lists thin, and steam power arrives, and bread finds new mathematics and factories that believe in steel and schedules. Yet the echo remains, that early thud of a scale pan settling, the civic heartbeat that said, not be excited, but be equal. It was small, and that is why it worked. It promised that supper would be lawful, even if the conversation was reckless. It taught thousands of towns that fairness is best delivered in ounces and in ordinary, repeatable daylight. If you're drifting now, let the old table be a pillow. Imagine the clerk folding the roll and tying it with twine. The baker sweeping flour into obedient hills. The taster hanging up his wooden cup where afternoon can find it tomorrow. Picture a row of loaves cooling like soldiers at ease, steam rising as faint as breath on a window. Somewhere a bell counts the hour. Somewhere a dog decides that today's crust is perfectly adequate. Somewhere the chain on the official weight taps the iron ring like a small metronome. The town does not notice it as being beautiful. It notices that bread has weight, that money has manners, that ale obeys a line drawn by people who would rather sleep than argue about it again. And if by morning you remember nothing but the phrase the size of bread, you will still carry a little of its comfort, the sense that humans once tamed hunger with a list and a scale and a bench, which is not dramatic and therefore quietly magnificent. You might not expect the quiet history of a 3x5-inch rectangle to be dramatic, and you would be correct, which is exactly why it is perfect for tonight. The library card catalog is a country of small laws and smaller pencils, and it once organized the reading of entire cities with the soft authority of a drawer that never slammed. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe, or you can simply let your eyelids adopt the filing policy of close for inventory. Either way, the cards will not mind. They have been patient since the 1870s and are prepared to be patient a little longer. The old catalog began with a table, then a box, then a forest of boxes, and finally an oak cabinet the size of a sensible wardrobe. Inside were drawers that slid like a well-bred thought, each holding about 1,000 cards that had no intention of hurrying. Every drawer were 2 brass label frames, one to say where you were and one to say where you were not. The second was for the range just beyond, so that a wandering finger could course correct without argument. Beneath the cards, a steel rod threaded through a little hole kept them from making a break for the reading room. A librarian with a tiny key could lift the rod like a trained guard lifts a barrier, and the nearest card, suddenly free, felt more important than literature. The size of the card was itself a treaty. 3 by 5 inches, not 4 by 6, because 3 by 5 fit more citizens in a drawer and could still be tamed by a typewriter ribbon that lived for efficiency. There were A to Z guides made of stiffer stock with polite tab ears, and there were blue C cards that did nothing but shepherd you toward a better guess. Some cards carried nothing but a cutter number, a kind of breadcrumb algebra that turned names into shelf coordinates with the calm of a bus schedule. A few had the small bruises of an eraser shield where a clerk had corrected a comma with surgical caution. The shield was tin, the eraser pink, and the correction smelled faintly of school. People who think librarians are quiet have never heard. A bank of drawers during the morning rush, the soft patter of cards being flipped, the whisper of a carbon copy, the thunk of a rod replaced, the rubbery sigh of a fingertip moistened on a sponge so one could turn pages without declaring war on friction. Microfact to admire and forget. Some catalogs used cards with the bottom corner snipped off to mark series. A diagonal opinion expressed in paper geometry. The catalog did not begin as furniture. It began as a wish. Melville Dewey, who wrote numbers the way other people wrote roads, proposed in 1876 that all knowledge could stand in 10 fields like obedient crops, and each field could be harvested into 10 smaller sections, and so on until you had a decimal that behaved like a breadcrumb trail. He also believed catalog should be spelled with as few letters as possible, which is why you sometimes find old manuals that look as if they have been gently shaved. The point, though, was kindness. A clerk in Des Moines could arrange books in the same general order as a clerk in Durban and be broadly understood by any visiting book scout armed with the right numbers. Drawers from Gaylord Brothers and Globe Warnick, manufacturers with names that sound like good neighbors, arrived with the odor of varnish and promises. The cabinets were heavy because certainty is heavy. Moving a catalog required a dolly, 3 humans, and a pep talk. Filing was a ritual that made monks look spontaneous. The rules were longer than some novels, and like good lullabies, they repeated. Articles were ignored. The is polite but not decisive. Middle names were respected. Hyphens, if present, were to be treated as brief handshakes, acknowledged but not clung to. Mick and Mac shared a diplomatic fence. Umlauts became vowels with ambitions. Nothing in the world advanced so slowly as a new author card being ushered into position by someone who had memorized the gentle arrogance of alphabetical order. Each card had a life story stamped across its chest. Main entry. Title, imprint, pagination, dimension, series, notes. Subject headings, tracings, and sometimes a small pencil number in the upper right that revealed how many people had been this way and demanded an accounting. The typewriter responsible for these biographies was usually a sturdy Underwood with a cataloging carriage, a winged affair that could line up hanging indents like a regiment. Carbon paper, folded with an etiquette that would make an envelope blush, produced twins for the shelf list and the author file. Somewhere, inevitably, a clerk reversed 2 letters in archaeology, and the entire afternoon acquired a gentle plot. Patrons learned the dance. Approach the cabinet. Pick a drawer with the confidence of someone selecting an apple. Pull it to the polite stop that prevents disaster. Use one finger like a compass needle and let the cards whisper past. Each card, a small billboard for a book you could theoretically hold in half an hour. Some nights, as the snow pressed its face against the library windows, a couple found each other in the drawers, one searching for cookery, historical, the other for stoves. Heating 19th century, and both privately studying the same photograph of a cast iron range printed in a municipal pamphlet from 1903. The catalog tolerated romance, but kept score. Their searches left no grease, only memory in the mind of a drawer. Microhook for the sleepless. Competing teams of student workers once raced to file 200 freshly typed cards. The winning speed, recorded in a minute book nobody consulted, was measured in drawers per hour, which is delightful because furniture became a unit of time. The catalog's authority lived not in any one card, but in the way it multiplied. For a single book, you might prepare an author card, a title card, a series card, and 2 or 3 subject cards, each traveling to a different drawer city, but saluting as they passed. A novel could thus appear in 5 places without being anywhere yet. A kind of bibliographic ubiquity that felt almost sympathetic to indecisive readers. Subject headings were a special species, clipped from the Library of Congress list, which is a book that reads like a map drawn by a patient cartographer and is nearly as hypnotic as rain. The headings did not try to be poetry. They tried to be useful, which is a more strenuous ambition. Kat's behavior has been saving afternoons for decades. Tracings, the list of where else this card should exist, ran along the bottom like a secret path. If a heading changed, say, Eskimos, learned to become Inuit, a tasteful blue pencil revised the clan, and the drawers accepted the news the way trees accept a new bird. There is a particular quiet to pre-closing catalog time. The lamps hummed. The watchman counted steps in the stacks because the map of his route fit comfortably in his shoes. Somewhere a child practiced alphabetical order out loud, and in doing so, invented a song no one would hear. A cataloger, finishing the last card of the day, tested the typewriter ribbon with one more period, as if to see whether night itself could be punctuated. Rubber finger Cott's thimbles for page turning aired on the sill like well-behaved caterpillars. The date due stamp cooled after a long day of declaring Wednesdays. An adult discovered an old charge slip tucked into a book and met the handwriting of someone who had borrowed the same volume in 1954. A ghost that could be identified and politely waved to. Another tiny fact to misplace on purpose: some cabinets greased their drawer runners with beeswax, which gave the furniture a faintly domestic shine. Others trusted paraffin. A few, in proud institutions near the sea, used unsalted butter until someone in acquisitions objected on culinary grounds, not of course. From time to time, the catalog had opinions. It disliked damp. It hated ash. It endured moths with the forbearance of an aunt. During renovations, it preferred blanket wraps. And when an entire building moved to a new address, it demanded a census, every drawer numbered, every stack of cards tied with cotton tape, every bundle logged as if it were a small nation in exile. In emergencies, librarians created temporary catalogs out of shoeboxes and optimism. A card misfiled by one tab is a traveler in a foreign land. The smallest errors produce the wildest stories. A pea in the cute country could spend a decade dreaming of reunion. The favorite superstition of many catalogers was to file troublesome cards in pairs. If they had company, they were thought to behave. In the margin of one training manual, a neat hand had written, "Remember, good filing is just quiet hospitality." The catalog forgave the note because it liked its truthfulness. Then, as history kept being itself, microfilm arrived with a whir like distant bees, and later, terminals with little green letters marched in with a certain crispness. The first online public access catalog spoke in square brackets and welcomed inquiries, with a blinking cursor that behaved like a polite tap on the shoulder. The drawers watched, neither threatened nor impressed, the way old trees watch weather. Libraries built migration plans with the seriousness of bridge engineers. Carts were copied, headings remapped, cut numbers parsed by software that had to learn that a .5 after a .49 is not the same as math. For a season, some libraries maintained both worlds, and the reference desk kept two voices ready. Try drawer 7, right-hand side, and let's search under subject begins with. Patrons learn that a keyboard also makes the sound of finding. The drawers stayed because furniture is slow to take offense, and because some things are easier to browse when your hands do the asking, yet even as screens multiplied. The old catalog found ways to be useful in its retirement. Genealogists discovered that the back of an ancient card sometimes carried notes in pencil about local authors and printers long since turned into street names. Poets visiting small-town museums found titles they had not meant to find because drawers indulge accidents. Children learn the pleasing fact that a book can exist in many mental places at once. Under rivers, bridges, civil engineering, and fairies history, which is a boring miracle and therefore the best kind. Some cabinets were sold to cafes that believed drawers should hold cutlery. Others convalesced in archives. A few lived out their days in hallways under ferns, which they tolerated patiently. The rods were removed and became wind chimes in a staff garden, where they ticked off breezes like a catalog of weather. If you are still awake, we can walk through an imaginary day that the cards considered perfect because nothing surprising happened. Morning. A cart of new books arrives with the mild excitement of pastry. Each book acquires its number, its subject headings, and the line on the card where a typing mistake would look most dramatic but does not occur. The cataloger eats an apple the way wise people eat apples without haste, between two title cards. After lunch, a teacher phones to ask whether the library holds a book on the history of glue. The catalog provides 3 candidates, 1 adhesive, 2 philosophical. Mid-afternoon, a student learns the difference between see and see also, which in human terms is the difference between a redirect and a suggestion. Closing time, the last patron returns a book of poems and asks, as a comment to the air, whether the catalog knows any more like it. The air replies with a drawer, the drawer with a card, the card with a shelf mark, and the shelf with a book that does not pretend to be destiny. The night watchman checks the windows. The drawers breathe slowly. A last card goes home. What endures beyond numbers and cabinets is the catalog's temperament. It believed that the world could be sorted gently enough to be found again. It believed that the difference between good and excellent is a tab cut just a little cleaner. It believed that the sound of a card sliding back into place is a kind of civic music. When you flip through it, you are also flipping through the hands of everyone who had ever asked the same question, which is the closest a building can come to conversation. Online catalogs are faster, broader, endlessly linkable. They can fetch you a book from 3 countries away while you're still deciding whether to add a comma. But they rarely ask you to slow your breathing to the speed at which linen paper yields. The drawers did that, and in doing so, they taught generations how to search without hurrying, to decide without panic, to read with a map nearby. Somewhere, in a town where winters are tidy and summers smell faintly of pencils, a small historical library keeps its catalog not because it must, but because it can. The cabinet has a nick on the second drawer from a day in 1939 when a volunteer misjudged enthusiasm. The brass is warm from hands that did not ask permission. A card near the middle of the M drawer carries a ring of tea where a cup once stood. The stain is perfectly circular, like a lunar eclipse of ink. The librarian, who is equal parts caretaker and translator, dusts each week with a cloth that has learned the dimensions of the wood. Sometimes a child asks what the rod is for. The librarian shows the key, lifts the rod, removes a single card, and lays it on the table, where it looks both modest and complete. The child traces the hole with one finger, nods, and returns the card to its society. We can end, or rather drift, with one last small fact that is sleepier than it sounds. Many libraries used to keep a dead catalog, which is not as macabre as it tries to be. When books were withdrawn, their cards were not destroyed, but retired to a separate drawer, where they waited in case someone remembered them. It was a place made of wants. The dead catalog is where curiosity goes when it wants to meet history without the risk of walking away with anything heavy. If the drawers in your head are beginning to close now, let them. The cabinet knows how to be silent while remaining useful. Tomorrow, the labels will still say what they say. The tabs will still point like small, courteous fingers. The rod will still guard the citizens. The decimals will still hum their quiet song. And if you wake in the night and wonder whether glue history is filed under technology or crafts, do not worry. The card will be there in the morning, exactly where it has always been, between two neighbors who have been making room for it for more than a century.